Fantasy Stories, Part 1. What are the objectives of fantasy stories? Listening. Listen for the setting of a fantasy story. Speaking. Describe a fantasy landscape. Reading. Read fantasy stories. Punctuation. Learn the use of semicolon. Vocabulary. Learn about context and word association. Grammar. Learn the past continuous and present perfect tenses. Thinking skills. Use brainstorming techniques to think creatively. Values and ideas. Talk about possible future. Writing workshop. Write a descriptive passage for a fantasy story. Have you ever imagined being on another planet or under the ocean or meeting fantastic creatures? Our preview goes along. A fantasy story is a narrative that deals with the imaginary times, places, and creatures. Fantasy stories are very popular. You can find people reading them at beach, on buses, on MRT, and even during recess. Visit any bookstore and you are likely to find an entire section devoted to fantasy stories. In groups, you can discuss these questions. Look at the picture above. How do you know it is from a fantasy story? What fantasy stories do you know? In what form are these stories told? The fantasy stories often have many descriptions of strange and unusual places. These descriptions have the following features: an introduction, a series of descriptive paragraphs, adjectives to describe things, adverbs to describe verbs, the use of similes and metaphors, the use of variety of tenses, especially the past tense. Why are fantasy stories so popular? One reason is that there are few stories as fun and imaginative as fantasy stories. They take us far away to new and delightful places. They are also full of courageous heroes, evil villains, exciting adventures, and terrible monsters. No wonder we never seem to get enough of them. Reflecting. Ask yourself these questions and discuss them as a class. Number 1, comics are fantasy stories that use a mixture of words or images. What about kinds of fantasy stories can I think of? Number 2, which is the most creative fantasy story I have ever read? Number 3, what kind of fantasy stories do I like to read and why do I like them? What are the settings for these stories? Are they set in the past, the present, or the future? Listening for descriptive detail. The Hobbit is one of the most famous fantasy stories ever written. It is about the adventures of a group of dwarves, a great magician, and a hobbit as they try to recover a precious load of gold that is being guarded by a terrible dragon. If you are not sure what a hobbit is or where one lives, listen to the following passage from the book. Punctuation. The semicolon. The semicolon is used to separate two distinct but related sentences. The following pairs of sentences may all be separated by a full stop. However, a semicolon is used instead to show that there is a close relationship between the first and second part between the first and second parts of sentence. Full stop. Yusrai wants to join the army. He has always been adventurous boy. Semicolon. Yusrai wants to join army. He has always been an adventurous boy. Number 3, relationship. Yusrai wants to join the army. This is because he has always been an adventurous boy. Full stop. Govind wanted to leave the party. His friends persuaded him to stay.